We're going to give it just a minute. I know it's top of the hour, so I'm looking forward to jumping into this, but we're going to give it a minute while people log in. So just out of fill in the blank sound, we are just talking about football, and Heidi has got many SEC coverage. I think Alabama's in SEC, Big Ten coverage. I don't know what other conferences.
Are there other conferences?
Yeah, they are kind of
primarily those two, yeah.
Kind of consolidating.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think you just mentioned your one daughter is a big Nebraska fan. So, but then your other daughters go Gophers.
Yeah, exactly. I have a Husker, a Gopher, and a Roll Tide. So.
Oh man, I had to say I would lean towards the Gophers and probably lean hard away from the Tide.
It was a great school, and I will tell you, as a Badger, I thought I had known football until you go to one of those SEC home games, and it's incredible. It's incredibly fun.
But I think they don't have much else going on in life, do they?
Neither does Nebraska really. So most college towns are like that. I think the Gophers are unique in that they're really engulfed by the city. And then my daughter loved that aspect of it. It didn't speak to me, but she loved it.
Yeah. Well, cool. No, it's a great experience that you're able to have with your daughters. All right. Well, we will jump into it. Today is part 3 of our 3-part series of succession success. Part 1 was the planning. Part 2 is preparing. And now part 3 that we're going to cover is profiting from your business exit. Again, this is an interactive webinar, so please, if you have questions, please ask them as we're going along, and then we'll get to it, to the question at the time, or if we feel it'll be covered later, then we'll probably get to it at a later time. So anyway, I'm excited about the panel. So joining us today is Dyanne Ross-Hanson. She has over 30 years of industry experience. She's extremely dedicated to helping business owners in achieving their exit or succession plan objectives, which are normally strategic, tax-efficient decisions. One of the key things that Dyanne does is she's extremely collaborative with the owners and all their advisors, and what we talked about in the other webinar was about having key advisory team pulled together, and Dyanne definitely can help facilitate that. Next we have is Heidi Carpenter, who's been a real commercial attorney focusing on providing counsel to investors, startup companies closely held of all sizes, and also within the transactional world as well. In the area of mergers and acquisition, Heidi is formidable negotiator, having negotiated mergers, acquisitions, and over multiple multi-million-dollar deals, with her largest transaction valued at $215 million. She represents bidders, targets, financial advisors, and bankers in structuring, negotiating, and closing deals. And then last but not least, my partner, Blake Johnson, has over 15 years working closely with sellers, buyers, and advisors throughout the information gathering, marketing, and transaction process. He conducts his team, they conduct a detailed research pertaining to their clients in regards of creating a go-to-market material, overseeing timelines, assisting with market development, and managing client communications with the buyers. So again, I'm really excited about this panel. Great expertise in a variety of areas. So we're going to just jump into it. So kind of our first item that I wanted to talk about was assessing your deal team. Why working with an experienced uh, legal, financial M&A advisor is crucial to a successful outcome, and what to look for in building your team. And I'm going to first start with you, Heidi, if you can talk to
Yeah,
them.
I think there's several reasons why you need experienced advisors on your deal team. Um, M&A deals are long and they're tedious, and arguably they're probably the most valuable business deal most sellers do in their entire career. So you want a team of experts that understand that really their number one goal is to protect your value and to protect you. I think skilled advisors understand that they have to structure deals to preserve your economics, to protect you from potential liability exposure, and to prepare you for or avoid any kind of post-closing surprises or circumstances. So, and when I think about advisors, financial advisors help you model outcomes and validate valuation and manage due diligence. Your legal advisors are going to ensure that your contracts and your reps and warranties and kind of the post-closing indemnities are tight. And your M&A and investment advisors are going to help you position your business, negotiate terms, and hopefully drive competition among buyers. If you have people that don't work in this area, I think you're not getting the most out of your deal in terms of value. That's arguably, I think, the most important reason why you need advisors. But I would also say you need experience because M&A deals are never clean. And when I mean clean, there's always an issue, whether that's a valuation issue, a liability issue, who's gonna assume what. And experienced advisors are gonna help you see around corners and predict kind of what buyers might be concerned about. I think an experienced advisory team keeps the deal moving while you're doing the deal and negotiating the terms and providing and answering all the diligence questions. You also have to keep your business running. So a good business advisory team is going to help you kind of bird dog some of those tasks and alert you when you need to be involved when the issue is critical. I think they also help you negotiate from strength. Most sellers don't sell companies very often. You may do it once or twice in your lifetime, maybe three. And a lot of buyers have bought a lot of companies. So you have very sophisticated buyers. And in order to level the playing field, you should have sophisticated advisors on your side, so you aren't out negotiated on terms. And I would say finally, they protect relationships. I think a really good advisory team is going to understand your goals. They're going to have the tough conversations for you. So that saves your relationship with the other business party, and they'll preserve all the goodwill that you've already built with the opposing party. They'll preserve it, they won't destroy it. And that's why you really need experienced advisors. Like, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think, again, this being part three and, if we're walking alongside a prospective seller or a business owner in this process, we've done the planning piece and some of the other things we've covered in the other webinars. But when you're truly making your selection of that deal team, I think Heidi hit on a couple of really key points. And one that I would reiterate and shout again is you lend yourself potentially to being outmatched in negotiation if you do not have quality advisors that are fit for your business, your deal, who you're targeting. And maybe Heidi, to kind of expand and drill into the specific, individuals you're assembling, what are some good questions that should be asked of legal advisors when sellers are approaching counsel? Because I know from our experience at SealedBid, having someone like yourself, or your colleagues at FMJ that do deals, you're capable of working alongside maybe a long-standing corporate attorney or a friend, but you have that transaction experience, which is so crucial. So could you highlight maybe, just some key questions that sellers should ask in those meetings?
Yeah, I think when interviewing legal counsel in particular, you're gonna wanna ask questions about their transaction experience, both in terms of the size of your business and the type of industry you're in. I mean, I would ask things like, have you closed deals that are of similar value and structure? Have you closed deals in this sector? Tell me about a deal that you've closed. Tell me what some of the key challenges are in this kind of deal that you've experienced. I think you need all of that type of experience. And I've seen clients make the misstep of having really great corporate counsel, but corporate counsel that's never done a deal. And sometimes right out of the gate, they can really jeopardize a deal because they will ask things that are outside of the market, or they may counsel the client to sign a letter of intent that is missing all kinds of structural and liability avoidance type of topics that you're later kind of married to because you signed the LOI agreeing to something that maybe you shouldn't have. I think on the other side, another question I would ask is, are you practical? Do you have deal-oriented thinking? Meaning every deal is going to have some risk and exposure. There's theoretical risk, which is a very academic exercise, and then there's practical. So I think you need to get a feel from your counsel of, are they someone who's going to send you 4 pages of warning about a risk that is, there's only a 5% chance of happening, or are they going to spend more time on the risk that's actually going to happen? And real risk versus what I call noise is important because, again, you could spend a lot of time and money trying to negotiate a point that isn't. And I'd also say, I think cultural fit and trust is important. During a deal, you will be talking to your legal counsel at least once a day. And unfortunately, during diligence, it may be 5 times a day during a 30-40 minute period. If this is a counsel that doesn't share your communication style or judgment, or doesn't understand your goals, you're going to find those conversations painful. And if there's an emotional issue that arises, I think you really have to have a cultural fit with your attorney.
Yeah, I think that's well stated. To jump back in here, I think we often say, to your point, you really have to have that people fit with your advisors, and you are in lockstep for several months of a process. And so to be working with someone that you either don't strategically align with or just don't communicate well with only adds additional hurdles to the process. I would continue to expand your response as it relates to screening questions and, in the lens of business broker, investment bank, and business intermediary. We're generalists, so deal experience, market experience, types of companies and specialties is definitely an area that we discuss quite frequently with our prospective clients. And there is certain businesses that lend themselves to specialists. I think there's far more similarities across across businesses, but there's specific industries that benefit. And there are, specific processes depending on who the target is and what the outcome the owner is seeking that lends to a larger M&A process versus more of a direct negotiation or a management buyout process like Dyanne can speak to. I think you've hit on the key things. The only other piece I would add is just understanding where in the process each of those advisors participates and what the expectation is of you as the seller in that process, because you'll find each advisor is maybe more active in certain segments, and there may be more put on your plate depending on the advisor you choose as a seller. So SealedBid is a full service we work through diligence alongside legal. We obviously do the marketing and the negotiation, but you'll find some attorneys that are more involved in schedules and diligence, and others that are more involved in documentation. And similarly, you'll find CPAs and investment bankers that are, similarly varied. Good to understand, at the forefront.
I think collaboration among your advisors is extraordinarily important. In getting all of your advisors on the phone at the beginning to bifurcate whose duty is what. And I think you're absolutely right. The stage of the deal will shift who's leading the deal. As buyers and offers are coming in, that's clearly your broker team. They are spearheading all of that and leading all of the conversations. As you review LOIs, that is really everyone on your team. So your accountant has to convey to the broker why a certain structure isn't going to work for a tax purpose. Your lawyers have to talk about indemnity and reps and warranties and some other hiccups that may exist or may be unique to the deal. And then once due diligence starts, that's really when your legal team starts playing a bigger role, in your accounting team as well. And negotiating documents, I think that's really all three. And historically, the broker preserves the client, the business to business party relationships. The lawyer spearheads all the conversations about legal and documents, and the accountants are in the background helping both parties navigate some of the issues and explaining to laymen on how impactful or how to properly document some of that stuff. So if you have a team that doesn't collaborate well or is redundant or doesn't understand who's in control of certain communications, that can be a real problem.
Diane, do you have any additional thoughts you'd like to share?
The only thought that I think comes to my mind is that as I'm working with owners who are giving thought as to, which direction do I go as far as ownership transition. And for those that make a definitive decision to say, no, I'm going to an outside versus an inside buyer. I'm curious, Blake and Heidi, if you've got recommendations of how long before an actual transaction the owner should be trying to assemble the right team.
Yeah, that's I'll answer and throw it to you, Heidi. That's definitely, that's a subject we've covered in this series. And I think, universally the commentary is the sooner the better. If you have years of planning in front of you, you can do things to mitigate tax. You can do things to set up success in the transition. You can pull levers to drive value in your business. Generally speaking, from the M&A seat, we like to be involved, 1 to 3 years in advance, but very frequently, it's several weeks or a month or two. But I think in an ideal world and then I'll kind of send this your way, Heidi, to start that collaborative process, takes time. And there are some strategies specifically around some of the tax mitigation and financial planning that take real time to implement.
I would say the earliest advisor you probably want to talk to about an exit strategy is for sure your financial planner, because they have to run models of what your expectations are after the sale. And then you have a better sense of what your goals are in the sale, both in terms of your role in the company after the sale, and especially in terms of what you need financially out of the sale. I think maybe the second advisor you should probably talk to is your accountant. They may be able to do a quality of earnings report for you before. Your accountant or a broker probably could do both of those. So you should make sure that the valuation of your company on the market is going to match what your financial expectations are. And it may stop at that point because it might not be where you need it to be. And then you pivot to figure out your growth strategy. It may exceed your expectations, which is fantastic. And at that point, then I think you hire, you start talking to your attorneys about contract assignments and key employees and compliance gaps and those types of things. And then you have the broker hit the street and find out what kind of buyers. Ideally, all advisors like to come in the earlier the better. Because I think we can help you maximize value and avoid pitfalls the earlier you include this, but I don't think it's terribly realistic. I've had several clients who have methodically done that. And, 3 years in advance said, I'd like to retire in 4 years. I've talked to my financial planner and here's where we're at. But that is almost the rare situation, at least in our environment. Especially as a deal advisor, usually we are maybe the last people retained if we don't have a previous relationship with the client. And then we kind of go to work and try to mitigate and fix stuff before it hits the street. So there's never a good time specifically. I think you can have a fantastic deal by putting an advisory group, an experienced advisory group together months in advance. I think the more time, the better, but that's not always the situation.
And again, that's something that we highly recommend is, when you're meeting, to pull these advisors together in a group meeting, because they all have different thoughts and process and recommendations, and the more that they can hear what you're thinking, what your goals are, and achieve, they can all weigh in at the same time, versus when you're doing individually, they might hear different things, and therefore you're losing a lot of collaboration that can end up in a better result. So we're huge fans. Like if you're meeting with your personal financial planner, maybe they don't have that much experience on the transaction side, there's thoughts and things that you might want to consider when you're doing a transaction, a donor advised fund, something similar like that, and how that fits into your beliefs, or you and your wife or your family, and succession going beyond the transaction. And again, having your CPA from a tax perspective involved, your wealth advisor, your attorney, and it could be transactional, or it could be your estate attorney, but having that team all together and collaborating and working through goes a much longer way than just individual conversations. And the other thing that you make me think of is, we always recommend that you need to choose a quarterback. So hopefully it's your deal M&A person like Blake that can help coordinate and facilitate the whole event, because it's a lot of moving pieces. And again, most of the time it's very limited number of people within the organization that'll know this. And yet there's a lot of moving parts, and how do you make sure it stays on track? Who's responsible for overseeing it? So just identifying a quarterback to facilitate it. And I think that kind of leads me to, how do you determine who that should be?
Yeah, I think experienced advisors, accounts brokers, and the legal team understand their area of expertise. So I mean, one quarterback isn't going to work for everything, and you have to be really careful. For instance, my legal team shouldn't be giving accounting advice, because heaven forbid if we give accounting advice that's contradictory to the accounting advisor. Blake and his team shouldn't be giving legal advice, because the key is not just collaboration, the key is consistency of messaging. And I think if the other party senses that they're getting 2 or 3 different answers from different advisors, it looks like you're pretty unsophisticated, but more importantly, it can create all kinds of problems. And sometimes this happens really inadvertently. I worked on a deal where a very eager new junior member of the broker team answered some questions about a verbal arrangement that the client had with a competitor and didn't get it 100% accurate, and then tried to correct the statement later. And they didn't understand when being asked the question that they were being asked antitrust questions. And their answers set up a very stereotypical case of antitrust. So we spent a lot of weeks and a lot of money on behalf of the client trying to override those answers and get them comfortable in the fact that no, we were not in fact involved. And I say we, the client was not in fact involved in any kind of antitrust handshake deal with a competitor. So if you have advisors that advise outside of their area of expertise without consulting the other advisors, you can really create issues that aren't really there fast. And then you start having a trust issue with the other party. So I think experienced advisors know where their roles are. And don't answer questions that are outside the role. They kind of go back, and if I get a tax or accounting question from the legal team, I make sure the client's accountant is on the call with me to answer and navigate those questions, because even if I understand it, it exceeds my expertise. And at the end of the day, it's the accountant that's taking control of the tax issues. So that's where I think collaboration and expertise is really.
Yeah, that kind of leads us into, avoiding deal disruption, because that's a great example of that. So common execution pitfalls and how something can get derailed in the transaction. Like, if you can touch on that for us.
Yeah, yep, I'll dive in, and Dyanne and Heidi, feel free to interject your experiences as well. But yeah, I think to Heidi's point, definitely, misalignment on the collective team, that can create roadblocks, it can create additional negotiation or expense. So having that collaborative effort is definitely one key disruption to avoid. And then, we've talked quite a bit in this series about making presentable and defendable financial and business records. That's part of the preparing process. And, again, depending on the timeline for the prospective seller or the company is, some of those things can be done well in advance. Some of them are being done on the fly while you're packaging the company for market. But, that is a major area of understanding and making sure the entire team is comfortable with what's being presented and the positions taken in the materials. A couple of key areas there are obviously the profitability metrics of the company, and as well as the working capital analysis. There's routinely deals that we've participated in that go quite far down the road into the legal diligence, into negotiation of purchase documents that hinge on some key working capital assumptions and metrics, and making sure that both parties are defining working capital the same way, viewing it the same way, targeting what is delivered at closing the same way. Could be its own webinar series. I'm sure there's several of them out there, but to give an example, we did a transaction earlier this year that is that actually a case where the buyer's group team had an error in their way that they were viewing working capital to the seller's benefit. And it sounds great from a sell side perspective, except for it created at least a 30-day extension of a process to retrench the negotiations, to keep tempers cool, and to navigate that issue. And so making sure that you're solid in your presentation, both in the actual direct presentation, defensibility, no errors, but also just in the understanding of the concept is key. We see a lot of disruption around transferability of key relationships that covers customers, that covers employees, that covers vendors. You know, if a business owner is still very much active in the day-to-day, is maybe the rainmaker or the sales driver, you know, that's a big piece of buyers' consideration when they come to the table on how they structure what that owner's doing post-transaction, how they scrutinize existing relationships, whether there's contracts in place or not. And so, you know, we've seen definitely the whole team, and especially legal, when it comes to contracts, you know, get involved in coordinating assignments. And, you know, it's safe to assume that the person you've known for 15 years is going to be ready to sign that assignment agreement in one day, right? Right, Heidi? I mean, that's just, you know, we're driving towards close. We got a week to get things done, and you're not really taking into account, you know, third parties and their impact on a deal. That we see that quite frequently. Another area of you know, kind of disruption would be in that employee base and the key employee base. We've had transactions where key management are either fired or they quit in the middle of a deal, and you know, understanding that in advance, being aligned with your team, even on a, you know, confidential basis or a written incentive basis is really key, depending on, you know, those people in your business that drive value and what the expectation would be of an acquirer. Yeah, I could tell quite a few different war stories. Maybe I'll throw out a few more subjects and then let, you know, Dyanne and Heidi chime in. But you know, deferred maintenance on assets is something that pops up in diligence. Environmental concerns on the real estate or whether it leased or owned of the business. You know, anything that would be, you know, concern to a buyer. You know, and just all overall sustainability and performance of the business. You know, everybody is trying to time profitability and the trend of their company to maximize value. You know, and some of that is manageable, and some of it, you know, is definitely the ebbs and flows with the business. But we've seen deals definitely go on hold if the backlog evaporates or the pipeline slows down. You know, that this process, as the team here has described, takes months, and you need to be, you know, have that certainty to get through a finish that the business is performing correctly.
I would agree. I would just add a couple things. Ideally, you have your story prepared on potential issues. So ideally, you know what potential weak points might be from the standpoint of a buyer, and you have your story about that. So if it's customer concentration, you have data, you can assure them about renewals and strength of contract, like you have, you talk about it before it comes up. If it's key employee dependence, you can talk about retention plans or stay bonus agreements that you have signed with employees, why, you know, reasons why they don't have to worry about your key salesperson terminating the day after the closing. I think if you're in a regulatory compliance heavy type of industry or business, you're gonna wanna already tell the story about your training, your audits, your policies, your history of issues. And if it's working capital issues or you have a seasonal business, you're ready with the story of, sure, we always lose money in first quarter, but in second quarter we pick up and then we double everything in third. Like, you have all of that stuff prepared, and you might even start talking about it through your broker before the buyer even questions it. Because I think through this process of them asking questions, either your team is going to be able to validate the value you're asking for, or they're going to reduce value because you're not prepared. And you can't prepare for everything they might find, but with a good team, you can usually see some of the issues. And if you can solve them before you talk to the buyer, all the better. But some of them are not solvable. So the best way is to have a story to put them a little more at ease of what they contemplate to be a risk.
I'm gonna move on, to understanding the deal structure, navigating the buyer's expectations, the diligence demands, and value drivers, during the whole deal process. Heidi, can you kind of touch on that? The deal structure?
Yeah. I think deal structure is extraordinarily important. Both in terms of value and in tax repercussions and exposure of post-closing liability. And I think you have to understand what the difference between a stock and an asset deal is in terms of liability exposure and in terms of tax. I think you have to be prepared for things like earnouts and rollovers and all kinds of things that are going to be usually foreign concepts to sellers. To your deal team, it should be pretty ordinary. And even something as simple as working capital. So working capital is a concept that the buyer wants to buy a company that has enough assets to service the business immediately after closing. You should know what your historical working capital is, what the expenses are, what that looks like, because the buyer's always going to suggest something more and you want less, because the more assets you have to keep in the business, the less usually cash at closing you get. And then there's usually a post-closing adjustment. So you have to understand all of that, because then when you're making decisions on trading one issue for another, you're better equipped to understand what you're giving up or what you're agreeing to.
Yeah,
you
and I
make
would
me
just,
go ahead.
add as kind of to tie in deal structure to deal disruption. It's a point that Heidi had noted earlier. A lot of those key structure pieces should be negotiated in the letter of intent and detailed in the letter of intent, as many of the business points as possible, which then limit the amount of negotiation you have to do in the legal purchase document process, and it keeps momentum moving forward, and ultimately that pre-LOI time is the time of most leverage when you're a seller. And so as you're marching forward, you want to make sure you're aligned on those structure pieces, working capital calculation, diligence requirements, all of those things that can create those roadblocks.
And ideally, the broker brings you more than one buyer. So ideally, you have 3 or 4 letters of intent that appear pretty on par economically. And that's where your advisors really can help in determining what deal is better. So one deal may be a asset deal, but with a bigger working capital target. So the purchase price is bigger, but the cash really is lower. Your deal team can help you with all of those kinds of items. And although letters of intent are non-binding, usually there's a couple sections that are binding, like confidentiality and, provision where you're not gonna talk to other buyers. Most of the other terms are non-binding, meaning you can, either party can change their mind later. But it's pretty customary that once you agree to, for instance, an indemnification cap or a cash at closing amount, you don't renegotiate that point from the letter of intent unless you discover something during diligence that would compel you to do so. So I think some sellers casually think, I don't need advisors, this is non-binding anyways, I'm just gonna agree to it. And all negotiated in the definitive documents. And that's really not the business practice. Although non-binding, it means that if the buyer or seller discovers something that has to change a term, that's doable. But it would be bad faith to sign an LOI with terms that you're gonna renegotiate anyways. It's just not It's not done that casual.
Yeah, you make me think of in regards to working capital, and I've heard that term a few times, but when I was talking to a friend of mine on he's with a PE firm, private equity firm, and he said a lot of times that becomes a difficult issue is once they do the true up and then there's a writing of the check required on the seller. And then they become interested in, well, I didn't realize that was included or excluded from working capital. That doesn't make any sense. And it's kind of too late at that. So having a clear understanding of what the definition of working capital is at the very beginning is crucial versus trying to negotiate it post-closing.
And that can be a very complicated concept of what's considered normal and how you calculate seasonal fluctuations and inventory levels based on that. There could be inconsistent accounting methods, pre-closing versus post-closing. And usually any kind of client deposits that are being taken, especially in a manufacturing company for large orders, how is that from an accounting standpoint been treated? It's really complicated. And I think that's, that speaks to how good your advisors are in helping you navigate some of those concepts. And sometimes those very specific points on working capital, because it usually is a dollar per dollar adjustment to the purchase price, have to be done at the letter of intent level.
Yeah. Well, this whole conversation, the series actually leads me to my favorite part. It's really post-transaction planning. Setting yourself up for success after the deal, personally, financially, and professionally. And again, my favorite part, because you've gone through, you've built your company, your organization, you had your success. Now you've pulled your team together, found a buyer, worked through the hard part of due diligence, negotiated the final purchase agreement, and you've closed. So Dyanne, can you kind of talk about, setting yourself up for success after the deal and what
Absolutely.
you've done?
Selling your business is not just, and I think all of us on this webinar know this, it's not just a financial event. For any owner, it really becomes a life event. And the deal may close on paper, but the transaction itself continues. The transition, I should say, continues long after the ink dries. When a business is sold, we often talk about, well, what the buyer gains, but we rarely talk about what the seller potentially loses or how they move forward. The sale's not the end of the journey for a lot of owners. It's a life transition. It's important for owners, I think, to prepare themselves, yes, financially, which we talked about, but personally and professionally, so that the next chapter isn't something that's fulfilling as the last. So if you talk about the financial, the personal, the personal success is kind of re-identifying identity. Who am I without my business? That's a very common challenge: loss of identity, loss of purpose. It's good. I always advise it's good to reflect on that before selling and thinking about, how are you going to fill your time? What's going to bring you fulfillment? Whether it's mentoring, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's family adventures, travel, new projects. I say, the happiest former owners are those who plan what they're running toward, not just what they're walking away from. So the personal success is so important. Financial success, yeah, it's not what you sell for, it's what you keep and how long it lasts. Knowing, and Heidi and both Blake have talked about this, knowing what your personal financial readiness number is so important. That's going to indicate, I think, how quickly you move down the process of selling. Because just as mentioned earlier, if through your financial advisor you've identified a capital amount required in order to enjoy what you define as financial independence, if your personal assets and the business value aren't going to match that, you've got a decision to make. You know, do you alter what you envision entire retirement to be, or do you, put the nose to the grindstone and create value in that business before taking it to market? So working with your advisors to model post-sale lifestyle, what the tax impact is, investment, those are all important, and it ties into, watching for what we've talked about: deal structure, earnouts, installment notes, retained equity. A good deal price doesn't automatically mean a secure retirement. And that's, I think, is important. Finally, professional. This is a tough one, and we talked about this as a group of panelists. Surviving the non-control role is very difficult for many owners. They're going from CEO to employee, and that's a very difficult adjustment. Post-sale roles can be emotionally challenging. It's important that as an owner and as a seller, you're clarifying what's the expectation before signing on the dotted line. Define what that role is, define the authority, define the timeline. Consider whether or not, you're looking at an advisory or an employment relationship. If an owner stays after the close in some capacity because of the deal structure that's been negotiated by Blake, by Heidi, by Cory, by the accountant, if the owner stays, my advice is to set an exit from the exit plan so that they can leave on their own terms. Because again, it's a financial decision, it's a personal decision, it's a professional decision, and envisioning that in advance of engaging the likes of Heidi, engaging the likes of Blake and Cory is so important. So know their personal financial number, plan the taxes, liquidity, income streams. That's all what a financial advisor is going to help from. Negotiate your post-sale role intentionally, not reactively. And again, with good advisors, they're going to tell you that. And start preparing emotionally now, not after the deal, so that you're not rebuilding identity in a crisis mode. I think those are the advice or the suggestions that I would suggest. Or observe, I should say.
I think those are all great points, Dyanne. I see it as from the standpoint of, you have a founder, CEO, that has built the business, and it is like another child. And, on the day of sale, it's extremely prideful, and it's a way to liquidate all that blood, sweat, and tears that probably you and your family have gone through over the years. But there's also a sense of grief, of loss, because it's not yours anymore. And I always have conversations with founders in particular where they have rollover equity, so they may be excited about reinvesting another, 20% into the buyer's business. But I always have conversations of, okay, so now you're banking on someone else when you've banked your entire life on yourself. How comfortable are you? And then a lot of sophisticated buyers want the person in charge around for a while. That makes sense. It's great for the employees and the customers and all kinds of reasons. And I always have a conversation about what that looks like realistically for a founder who then is the president for 2 years, that's answering to a more institutional board, maybe. No longer has unilateral authority to decide how much debt to burden the company with. Like, how does that feel? And I always prepare them. I'm like, you're probably not going to like it. It's just different. And
Totally.
you may be okay with it because there's a value proposition involved. So you can control an earnout. And maybe that rollover equity is going to be a lot of money and you'll stomach it for those reasons, but you're probably not gonna like it. So
Right.
in addition to the deal documentation, I have to put together an employment agreement with terms
Right.
you can live with. And also an operating agreement, because if you're gonna be an owner with these brand new partners, do you have a say? Do you have a board seat? What kind of decisions and authority are you gonna have before you have to talk to the board? Are you comfortable doing that? And you spend a lot of time figuring out what that post-closing role is going to be, so it's satisfying to the founder. And if you have those conversations, I don't know if I shouldn't say ever, because that's so extreme, but I can't recall a client who's called me after selling their business and said, I should have never done it. I just have not, because good advisors like prepare them and yourself prepare them for what that reality is. Now, I have
Right.
plenty of clients who say, I don't know what to do with my time now, for sure. And I think the younger the seller, when you have a 42-year-old that sells for a lot of money, they still have a lot of runway. I do see a little bit of identity crisis afterwards.
Oh,
What
yeah.
do with my time and now my money?
Yeah. And so many of the professional connections that owners have are derived through their ownership and their leadership. And then all of a sudden, unless they're moving to something, something else, absolutely all of that changes. Not only the personal identity, but the network and yes, how are we going to spend our time? For the young professional, though, like you mentioned, Heidi, I'd be interested, and maybe there are some of those on the webinar. I mean, typically they're not just sitting back and kicking their feet off and sailing off into the sunset. They're starting a new adventure or a new enterprise, either with some of their network or alone. But that's what I see for those younger sellers.
Yeah, usually it's entrepreneurship 2.0, right?
Yes,
Entrepreneur is always going to be an entrepreneur.
yes,
No, and then I've had other clients who at the end of their professional career have said pretty blatantly, I don't want any role in the company for even a day,
yeah.
or I'll answer phone calls. But I promised my wife we were gonna sail around the world and that's what we're gonna. More clarity, and they've indicated, I'll take worse, terms or less favorable terms.
Yeah,
Maybe price, so I can just hand the keys over and nobody calls me.
absolutely.
But I think I think all of that pre-planning and discussions are so important. So you don't
Absolutely.
have regrets after the transaction.
Absolutely.
Diane, a question, what do you think is the most overlooked part of life after a sale, whether it's financial independence or personal purpose or business legacy? I mean, you've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs that have sold, and what owners wish they had planned for sooner. So you
Yeah.
can bring to mind?
The financial piece is identifiable. You can push the pencil, I think, with all of us, and we would agree that, knowing what the financial readiness is I think easily tackled. Much more difficult, just like we've been talking about, are, the personal and the professional. The professional is going to depend, the professional development or what they're going to do. That depends a lot, I think, as Heidi had mentioned, on the entrepreneurial ship of the individual, the age of the seller, whether or not there may have been any regrets in that process. But I think the biggest one is just that personal, some of those personal dynamics, that you have a role, that they've been the center, they've been in charge, they've made all the decisions. And all of a sudden, yes, depending upon whether or not they remain with the company, which is a choice, it's part of that deal negotiation, which Blake, I think, and Heidi have both addressed. I think that, that's probably the most difficult. So giving time and thought to that in the process of evaluating what their objectives are, I think is important, because as I work with owners, I tell them, my job isn't to replace, nor could I, a Heidi, a Blake, a Cory, an accountant, a financial advisor. It's really to help the owner understand what their ownership transitions are. It's not just outside. Absolutely, outside is going to be your most profitable, and that's what we're talking about. I say that generally, but it's really helping them understand what are the options, what is realistic, what are the advantages and the disadvantages, and okay, once those are made, now how do you build that team that's going to be necessary? Because the reality is, and I've said this in our earlier sessions, the reality is every single business is going to transition ownership, either by design or by default. And the best exits are those that are planned early and surrounded with experienced expertise, which is really what we've tried to bring to our audience throughout all three of these succession sessions. So I appreciate BGM bringing it front and center.
Yeah, yeah. Blake, I don't know if you have any.
No,
You're
I
probably
think
too young.
you know,
He's one of those entrepreneurs who's going to be in it forever.
oh yeah, no, my wife and I joke that I can't get any more hobbies because I don't have any time for it. So yeah, no, I think I'll just kind of again, telling war stories from from past successes where we've seen the best results and the post-transition satisfaction is, I think Dyanne phrased it more eloquently than maybe we have, is it's you're planning for that future as opposed to just planning for what you're leaving behind. And now I've butchered how you said it, Dyanne, but it is those that have done the planning that feel comfortable with their business and understanding its worth and what's needed for it to be successful going forward, and then executing a plan that maximizes value within that context. And so we've seen success with participation and contract or rollover equity
Right.
by leaders. We've seen success in immediate exits. And it's really making sure that you've done the consideration up front to know what you as an individual require.
Yeah, yeah. Well, great. I do appreciate everyone's time and input, and as usual, I even learn some new things. So do appreciate all of your time. And as usual, I hope that our listeners were able to pick something up from this. And we will just let you know, we will be sending out the recording to all those that were able to make it or those that registered and weren't able to make it. But definitely, if you have any questions that we can help you with, there will be contact information being provided to everyone. So have a great rest of the day. And then again, Dyanne, Blake, and Heidi, thank you for your time and expertise over the last three webinars on this subject.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Thank you, Cory.